What would you do if you found yourself alone in Alaska's frozen wilderness, with something hunting you that shouldn't exist? I'm your host from Silent Fears, and today we're diving into 11 absolutely terrifying true stories of tourists who ventured into America's last frontier and encountered horrors beyond imagination. From mysterious disappearances on frozen highways to ancient evils lurking beneath glaciers, these first-hand accounts will make you question everything you thought you knew about Alaska's untamed wilderness. Are you ready to face the silent fears that haunt the frozen north? Hit that subscribe button and let's begin. Let's move to our first story. My name is Raphael, and I've been driving trucks for 15 years. But what happened on the Dalton Highway last February still makes me check my rearview mirror every few miles. I've always thought myself a practical man. You have to be when you drive the Dalton. Most folks know it by reputation, some from watching ice road truckers, others just from the stories. 400 miles of twisted, treacherous road, stretching from the flat, dark forests outside Fairbanks to the cold edge of the Arctic Ocean. Officially, it's called Alaska Route 11, but no one calls it that. Not out there. Everyone calls it the road to nowhere. A place where common sense and luck matter as much as any skill with an 18-wheeler. Last year, February, the worst cold snap in a decade hammered Alaska. Nights dropped to 40 below. The daylight lasted maybe 4 hours if you were lucky. I was northbound out of Fairbanks, hauling a load of piping for the oil fields up in Deadhorse. I'd run the route dozens of times, but every winter feels like starting over. No matter how many chains you throw or how careful you are, something about the Dalton changes every year. This time was different. It was a gnawing dread, a chill that crept in through my insulated jacket, into my bones. By the time I reached the Yukon River crossing, the dusk had already settled. The sky streaked with blood, orange and sapphire like an oil spill across the horizon. At mile 56, I radioed dispatch. Static cracked back, faint voices from other drivers. Some miles ahead, most already hunkered down for the cold night in their cabs or at Coldfoot Camp. Coldfoot, mile 175, is the last stop for fuel, coffee, and another set of chains before you climb into the real wilderness. After that, you're on your own. I pressed on after a cup of truck stop coffee so bitter it could wake the dead. The road twisted and heaved beneath my tires, throwing up sheets of powder behind me. Visibility dropped to a blur in minutes. The Brooks Range loomed ahead, jagged black teeth rising out of the snow. I slowed to a crawl, crawling up toward Atigun Pass, the highest year-round road in Alaska, just under 5,000 feet. Wind howled around the cab, shaking the box like a child rattling a Christmas present. Every so often, my CB crackled to life. Snatches of static, threads of conversations too fragmented to make sense of. I kept hearing the word whiteout, followed by anxious tones cut off abruptly. Past the pass, the road dropped into a long, lonely valley. No lights, no tracks. Just me and the endless cold. I kept one eye glued to my mirrors, the other jumping between my instrument panel and the icy ribbon of road ahead. Somewhere not far from Happy Valley, maybe mile 262, the engine chugged heavy, and my teeth started to chatter even with the heater set to max. I stopped and checked the tires with my flashlight, hearing my own grumbling echo in the silence. That was when I first saw her. Standing at the edge of my headlights, bundled in a red parka, one glove clutched around a battered backpack. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and her shadow pooled out behind her, freakishly long in the low beam. Out here, you sometimes see hitchhikers. Sometimes even in winter. desperate souls who missed a ride or broke down miles back. It's against every rule of trucker sense to pick one up, but guilt pricked at me. In weather like this, you don't last long on the Dalton. I rolled down the window a crack, letting the cold bite my skin. You stranded? You all right? She stepped forward hesitantly. Her voice didn't shake, though her lips were blue. My car broke down. I just need a ride to the next stop. Climb up, I said. She hesitated a second, then nodded and swung herself up into the cab beside me. I turned the heat up a notch and offered her a half-frozen bottle of water. She thanked me quietly, hands trembling. I started rolling again, more than a little uneasy with the extra passenger. I tried not to look too hard at her face. It's a funny thing, but looking at her directly hurt my head, like trying to remember a bad dream. As we drove, I tried to strike up a conversation, but she only gave the barest answers. Her name was Reed, or, at least, that's what she claimed. She said she was headed north to Wiseman, an old gold mining town off the main road, but she never explained what drew her there in the middle of winter. Her backpack sat in her lap, never leaving her grasp. Odd things started to happen then. Every station I tried on the CB radio dissolved into white noise the moment I keyed the mic, even the weather reports. The air felt thicker, heavier. The headlights seemed to strain against the darkness, and shadows pooled outside every window. I watched my fuel gauge nervously. The needle started to nudge toward E, even though I'd filled up at Coldfoot. I noticed strange details about Reed. Her parka was an outdated style I hadn't seen in decades. The patches on her backpack were all faded, and one bore a logo for a trucking company that I knew had folded years ago. Her boots, I'll never forget those boots, were scuffed raw, crusted with ice, and tied with mismatched laces, one red, one gray. She never said how long she'd been out here, and I started to believe she didn't know herself. At one point, we rounded a bend, and Reed gasped. Looking ahead, I saw animal tracks in the fresh snow, but they weren't moose or wolf or anything I could name. Huge, splayed prints, almost human but elongated, twisting off the road and vanishing toward the tree line. "Do you see that?" she whispered, clutching her bag tighter. I tried to calm her, saying it was probably a bear. But the fear I felt was bone deep and ancient, like the memory of something hidden under the bed. We passed the tracks and drove another few silent miles, the only sound the tires crunching on ice and the low moan of wind through the cracks in the door. Not long after, she told me to pull over. "This is where I get out," she murmured. There was nothing outside but blackness and snow, no shelter, no road signs, not even a trail. "You sure?" "There's nothing here." She only looked at me, eyes impossibly wide and dark. "Thank you." She stepped down, boots crunching softly. I caught a glimpse of her face, twisted with an expression I can only describe as relief and sorrow at once. She walked to the edge of my headlights and stood there, perfectly still. Then, with uncanny speed, she vanished into the dark, as if she'd been swallowed. For a moment, I sat there, engine idling, breath fogging the cab. I reached over. Her seat was ice cold, not even the faint warmth a human should have left. I looked down and saw, in the rubber mat, a trail of wet, salt-stained footprints leading from the passenger side, across the dash, down to the snow outside. I waited a long time, too afraid to move. When I finally forced myself to continue down the road, I tried to tune the CB again. It crackled suddenly alive. Raphael, come in." It was a voice I recognized. Old Meadow, another regular trucker on the haul road. But his voice was warped, slow, and echoing. You shouldn't have stopped for her. The radio hissed. It always needs another. I nearly threw the mic out the window. The cold inside the cab grew unbearable. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold the wheel. As I crawled north, I kept checking my side mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure running along behind me. At dawn, the sky barely pink at the horizon, I reached Dead Horse. I staggered inside the dispatcher's office, white as a ghost, and told them what happened. The old-timers looked at each other with a kind of knowing dread. One of them, grizzled beard, hands as rough as sandpaper, told me I'd given a ride to the Dalton hitchhiker. She's been out there since before the pipeline. He whispered. Always in winter. People pick her up and they always see tracks afterward, but never hers. Some drivers vanish next run. Some swear she saves them from worse things. But none of them come back the same. I left Dead Horse that night, heading south with an empty trailer, driving faster than I should have. To this day, I see wet footprints in the back of my cab whenever the weather turns, and sometimes, just past Happy Valley, I think I spot a red parka by the tree line, waiting. If you drive the Dalton, remember this much. Never stop for anyone after sundown, not even if they look cold or desperate, especially not then. Out there on the road to nowhere, some passengers aren't looking for a ride, they're looking for something else. And if you pick them up, they'll never really leave your truck. Not ever. Let's move to our second story. My name is Serena, and I thought I knew every crack and crevasse in Exit Glacier until the day one of them started screaming back at us. I've been guiding glacier tours in Alaska for 6 years now, ever since I moved up from Colorado after college. There's something about the ice that calls to you. The way it creaks and moans like a living thing. The brilliant blue depths that seem to go on forever. The raw power of something that's been moving for thousands of years. Exit Glacier in Kenai Fjords National Park was my specialty. I knew that ice better than most people know their own neighborhoods. Every serac, every crevasse, every safe route and danger zone was mapped out in my head like a blueprint. The group that morning was typical for late March. 4 tourists from New York who'd never seen anything bigger than Central Park, let alone a glacier. There was Milani, a retired teacher in her 60s who kept taking pictures of everything. Her husband, Jake, who complained constantly about the cold. And a younger couple, Frederick and Emery, who were on their honeymoon and treating the whole thing like an Instagram photo shoot. Standard city folks who thought nature was something you looked at through windows. I'd done the safety briefing 100 times before. Stay together. Follow my exact footsteps. Don't wander off the marked route. The glacier might look solid, but beneath that surface was a maze of hidden crevasses that could swallow a person whole. I showed them my probe pole, explained how I'd test the snow ahead of us, and made sure they all had their crampons fitted properly. The weather was perfect, clear skies, minimal wind, and the ice was in good condition. Just another routine tour. We started up the glacier around 9 in the morning. The first hour went smoothly. I led them along the established route, pointing out the different types of ice formations, explaining how glaciers moved and carved the landscape. Milani was fascinated by everything, asking detailed questions about the blue color in the deeper ice. Jake warmed up once we got moving, and the newlyweds were getting their perfect shots. I was feeling good about the group. They were listening, following instructions, and genuinely enjoying themselves. It was about 2 hours in when we reached what I call the maze, a section where the glacier's surface is broken up by a network of smaller crevasses, none too dangerous if you know where to step. I'd taken hundreds of people through this area without incident. I was probing ahead as usual, testing each step, when Frederick called out from behind me. "Hey, Serena, what's down there?" He was pointing to a crevasse about 20 feet to our right, one I knew was maybe 15 feet deep and perfectly safe to observe from a distance. "That's what we call a moulin," I called back, not even looking. "It's where surface water drains down into the glacier. They can be pretty deep. But that one's not too bad. We'll get a better look at some bigger ones up ahead." That's when I heard it. A sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It started low, almost like the glacier's normal groaning, but then it rose in pitch and became unmistakably human. Someone was screaming. Someone was down in that crevasse. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Did you guys hear that?" The group looked confused. Milani tilted her head. "Hear what, dear?" The sound came again, clearer this time. It was definitely a voice, calling for help, echoing up from the depths of the ice. But that was impossible. I had checked the park's incident reports that morning. No one was missing, no one had fallen. And that crevasse wasn't even deep enough for someone to get seriously trapped. "Someone's down there," I said, my training kicking in. "Everyone stay put. Do not move from where you're standing." I approached the crevasse carefully, probing every step. The screaming was getting louder, more desperate. It was a man's voice, though the echo made it hard to make out words. As I got closer to the edge, I could hear him clearly. "Help me. Please, I can't get out." I reached the rim and looked down. The crevasse dropped into blue-black darkness, much deeper than it should have been. And there, maybe 30 feet down, I could see movement. A figure in a red jacket, waving frantically. "Sir, can you hear me?" I shouted. "Are you injured?" "I've been down here for hours," came the reply. "My leg is broken. Please get me out." This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. I'd been past this spot a dozen times in the last month. That crevasse was 15 feet deep, with a visible bottom. Now it seemed to go down forever, and there was a person who couldn't possibly be there. I backed away from the edge, my mind racing. I called the group over, keeping them well back from the crevasse. "I need to radio for a rescue team," I told them. "There's someone trapped down there." But as I reached for my radio, Frederick grabbed my arm. "Serena, look." I followed his pointing finger. There, standing at the edge of the crevasse we'd just left, was a man in a red jacket. He was maybe 50 yards away, waving at us casually, like he was saying hello. The screaming from the crevasse continued. My hands shook as I raised my binoculars. The man on the surface was middle-aged, bearded, wearing that same red jacket. He looked perfectly fine, perfectly normal. But the voice from the crevasse was still calling for help. "How is there?" Emery's voice trailed off. I keyed my radio, trying to reach park headquarters, but got only static. The screaming from the crevasse was getting more frantic, more desperate. But now there were words I could make out clearly. "Don't look at him. Don't let him see you looking." The man on the surface started walking toward us. His movement was wrong, too smooth, like he was gliding over the ice instead of walking on it. And as he got closer, I could see his face more clearly. His expression never changed. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, just blank. But his eyes were locked on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "We need to leave. Now," I said, turning the group around. "Back the way we came. Stay close, follow my exact footsteps." "What about the person in the crevasse?" Milani asked. "He's not in the crevasse," I said, though I couldn't explain how I knew that. As we retreated, I could hear the surface figure calling to us in the same voice that had been screaming for help. "Wait, please, I need your help." But now the tone was different, not desperate, but hungry. The voice from the crevasse had gone silent. We moved as fast as we dared over the treacherous ice. I kept looking back, and the figure in red was following us, always maintaining the same distance. Sometimes he was walking normally. Sometimes I'd look back and he'd be standing in a spot he couldn't possibly have reached so quickly. Once, I swear I saw him standing on a section of ice that I knew had a hidden crevasse underneath, standing where he should have fallen through. It took us 3 hours to get back to the parking area. 3 hours of that thing following us, always just far enough away that we couldn't make out details, but close enough that we knew it was there. None of us spoke much during the descent. What was there to say? When we reached the visitor center, I immediately reported the incident to park rangers. They took it seriously, sent out a search and rescue team with full crevasse rescue equipment. They spent 6 hours on that glacier, checking every crevasse in the area. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone in distress, no evidence that anyone else had been on the glacier that day besides our group. The crevasse I'd heard the screaming from measured exactly 15 feet deep, just like it always had. The rangers were professional but skeptical. Glacial ice plays tricks on sound, they said. Voices can carry for miles, echo strangely, seem to come from places they don't. Maybe I'd heard someone from a completely different part of the park. Maybe the stress of leading a group had made me imagine things. But they couldn't explain the figure we'd all seen. I never guided on Exit Glacier again. Couldn't bring myself to go back. The Park Service was understanding, transferred me to boat tours in the fjords, where the ice stays safely in the distance. But even now, 2 years later, I sometimes dream about that voice echoing up from impossible depths. And in those dreams, I'm the one trapped in the crevasse, screaming for help while something wearing my face walks around on the surface above, leading tourists to their doom. I've talked to other guides since then, quietly, carefully. You'd be surprised how many have stories about the ice. Voices where there shouldn't be voices. Figures that don't quite behave like people. Things that live in the deep places where the ice has been. Compressed for centuries, where the blue gets so dark it's almost black. The tourists from that day? Melanie sends me Christmas cards. Jake still complains about the cold in his emails. Frederick and Emery got their perfect photos, except in every single one they took of the glacier. There's a small red dot in the background that none of us remember seeing at the time. The glaciers are melting, they say, retreating faster than ever before. Maybe that's why these things are becoming more active, more bold. Maybe they know their time is running out and they're getting desperate. Or maybe they're just getting hungry. If you ever visit Exit Glacier, stick to the marked trails. Don't listen to voices calling from crevasses, no matter how human they sound. And if you see someone in a red jacket who doesn't seem quite right, don't try to help them. Just walk away. Walk away and don't look back. Because some things that live in the ice aren't meant for the surface world. And they're very, very good at pretending to be human. Let's move to our third story. My name is Armani, and I inherited more than just land when my family left me that old mining claim in Kennecott. My great-grandfather worked the copper mines back in the 1920s, before the crash sent everything to hell and the company packed up overnight. Family stories painted him as a hard man who made good money pulling red metal from the mountain. But he never talked much about why he left Alaska so suddenly in 1938. Just packed his tools, took the last train south, and never looked back. When he died, he left me his old claim papers and a key to what he called the family cabin up in the abandoned town. I'm a retired history professor, spent 40 years teaching about the American frontier. So when I finally made the trip up to Kennecott last October, it was partly professional curiosity and partly family obligation. The McCarthy Road is still a nightmare. 61 miles of washboard gravel that'll shake your teeth loose. But I needed to see where my roots came from. Maybe find some closure, some understanding of why the old man never spoke of his time in the mines. Kennecott sits in a valley surrounded by mountains so steep they look like broken glass against the sky. The town is preserved now, turned into a tourist attraction. But in October, after the summer crowds have gone home, it's as empty as a graveyard. The mill building dominates everything. 14 stories of weathered wood and rusted metal, the largest wooden structure in the world when they built it. Walking through those streets, you can almost hear the echoes of pickaxes and dynamite, the voices of 200 men who once called this desolate place home. I found the cabin easily enough. It sat on the edge of town, smaller than the main buildings, but solid, built to last through decades of harsh winters. The key still fit, though the lock protested with decades of rust. Inside, everything was exactly as my great-grandfather had left it. A pot-bellied stove, a simple cot, shelves lined with mining tools and supplies. Dust covered everything like a shroud, and the air smelled of old wood and something else. Something metallic and unpleasant. What struck me immediately was how recently inhabited it felt. The supplies on the shelves weren't just old mining equipment from the 1930s. There were modern items, canned food with dates from last month, fresh batteries, a sleeping bag that looked brand new. Someone had been living here, and recently. I spent the first day exploring, taking photographs, making notes. The tourist literature painted Kennecott as a ghost town, abandoned since 1938. But I kept finding signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dust that weren't mine. A coffee cup that was still warm when I found it sitting on a windowsill. Fresh ashes in fireplaces that should have been cold for decades. The second night, I decided to stay in the cabin instead of driving back to McCarthy. I wanted to feel what my great-grandfather had felt, to understand the connection between our family and this place. I built a fire in the stove, opened a can of soup, and settled down with the journals I'd brought to record my observations. That's when I found the notebook. It was sitting on the small table beside the cot, a leather-bound journal that hadn't been there that morning. I was certain of that. I'd examined every inch of the cabin. The leather was soft, supple, like it had been well maintained. When I opened it, I recognized my great-grandfather's handwriting immediately. I'd seen it on old letters, but this was different. The writing was fresh, the ink dark and clear. The first entry was dated 3 days ago. October 15th. Armani arrived today, just like I knew he would. He looks just like his father at that age. Same stubborn jaw, same way of tilting his head when he's thinking. He's staying in my cabin, touching my things, trying to understand. But he doesn't know yet what this place really is. My hands shook as I turned the page. This was impossible. My great-grandfather had died in 1987. I'd attended his funeral, watched them lower his coffin into the ground in Spokane. The next entry was worse. October 16th. He's finding the signs now. The fresh supplies, the warm coffee, the footprints. He thinks someone else is living here, some squatter who's moved into the abandoned town. He doesn't realize that time works differently in Kennecott. The mines go deep, deeper than anyone ever mapped. Some things that go down there don't come back up the same way they went down. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. This was some kind of sick joke. Someone was playing an elaborate prank, maybe one of the local guides who knew about my family connection. But as I looked around the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water. On the wall, there was a photograph I hadn't seen before. It showed a group of miners standing in front of the mill building. The photo was old, clearly from the 1920s based on the clothing and equipment. But in the front row, clear as day, stood a man who looked exactly like me. Same face, same build, same stance. He was wearing clothes I recognized. The same jacket I was wearing right now. I checked my phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. There never was in Kennecott. I was completely alone, or so I thought. The journal was open again when I looked back at the table. Fresh ink gleamed on a new page. October 17th. He found the photograph tonight. He's starting to understand, but he's fighting it. They all fight it at first. The mine shafts connect more than just different levels of the mountain. They connect different times, different possibilities. Some of us have been working these tunnels for decades, waiting for the family to come back, waiting for the cycle to complete itself. I ran outside, gasping in the cold night air. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, but they seemed wrong somehow, arranged in patterns I didn't recognize. The mill building loomed against the darkness, and I could swear I saw lights flickering in the windows. Not electric lights. The power had been cut decades ago, but the warm glow of oil lamps and lanterns. As I stood there, I heard it. The sound of pickaxes striking rock, echoing up from deep beneath the ground. The rhythm was steady, methodical, like dozens of men working in perfect unison. But that was impossible. The mines had been sealed for safety decades ago. No one was supposed to be down there. I went back inside, slamming the door behind me. The journal was open to a new page. October 17th. He can hear us working now. The sound carries up through the shafts, through the years. We never really stopped, you know. The copper is still there, waiting to be pulled from the rock. The company left, but the work continues. It has to continue. Some things can't be abandoned, can't be left unfinished. I tried to leave that night. Threw my things in the car and drove as fast as I dared down the treacherous road. But somehow, no matter how long I drove, I kept ending up back in Kennecott. The same buildings, the same streets, the same cabin with the door standing open, waiting for me to return. The journal had a new entry every time I came back. He's learning that some inheritances can't be refused. The mining claim isn't just land and mineral rights. It's an obligation, a debt that passes from father to son. My grandfather worked these mines before me, and his grandfather before him. We thought we could leave, thought we could escape to the outside world. But Kennecott calls its own home. On the fourth day, I stopped trying to leave. What was the point? The journal was right. This was my inheritance, my responsibility. I'd been called back to finish what my family had started more than a century ago. The supplies in the cabin never run out. The tools never wear down. And deep beneath the ground, I can hear my ancestors working, their pickaxes ringing against stone in a rhythm that's older than time itself. If you're reading this, if someone finds this account, don't come looking for me in Kennecott. The town looks abandoned from the outside, but it's far from empty. We're all still here, the miners, the families, everyone who ever called this place home. We're waiting in the tunnels, working the claims that can never be fully exhausted. And if your family ever worked these mines, if you have any connection to this place at all, you'll be back someday. The mountain remembers its own, and some debts echo through generations. The copper never runs out. The work never ends. And in Kennecott, no one ever really leaves. Let's move to our fourth story. My name is Jordan, and I learned the hard way that when you hear your own voice calling for help in the Alaskan wilderness, you should never, ever answer back. I'm a wildlife photographer from Portland, and I'd been planning this trip for months. The dense spruce forests around Talkeetna are some of the most pristine in Alaska, home to lynx, wolves, and black bears that most people never see. My goal was simple: spend 2 weeks camping alone, capturing the untouched beauty of the wilderness. Maybe getting some shots that would finally land me that National Geographic contract I'd been chasing for years. October seemed like the perfect time. The summer crowds were long gone, the leaves were turning brilliant gold and crimson, and the wildlife would be more active as they prepared for winter. I'd done solo trips before, spent weeks in the Montana Rockies, the Oregon Cascades, even the remote corners of Yellowstone. I knew how to handle myself in the wild, how to read weather patterns, how to stay safe around predators. Or at least, I thought I did. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. I hiked deep into the forest, following game trails that hadn't seen human feet in years. The photography was incredible. I caught a family of lynx hunting in the early morning light, got some stunning shots of a bull moose in a misty clearing, and even managed to photograph a pack of wolves from a safe distance. My camp was perfect, too. A small clearing beside a creek, far enough from any trail that I wouldn't be disturbed, but with good sight lines in case any large predators decided to investigate. It was on the 4th night that things started to go wrong. I was sitting by my campfire, reviewing the day's shots on my camera, when I heard it. A voice calling from somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. It was faint, almost lost in the sound of the creek, but unmistakably human. "Help! Please, someone help me!" I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the tree line. "Hello? Where are you?" The voice came again, clearer this time, and my blood went cold. It was my voice. Exactly my voice. Same tone, same inflection, calling for help from somewhere out in the forest. I told myself it was an echo, some trick of acoustics bouncing my own shouts back from the mountains. But the forest around me was dense spruce and birch. There was nothing that should create that kind of echo effect. And the voice wasn't repeating what I'd said. It was calling out different words, pleading for rescue in a tone of desperation that made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of that night huddled in my tent, listening to my own voice crying for help from different directions in the forest. Sometimes it sounded close, just beyond the reach of my campfire. Other times it seemed to come from miles away, echoing through the valleys like a lost soul wandering the wilderness. The next morning, I almost packed up and left. Almost. But in the daylight, with the sun filtering through the trees and birds singing in the canopy, it was easy to convince myself it had been some kind of auditory hallucination. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Or maybe I'd heard another hiker in distress and my tired brain had processed it wrong. I decided to stay one more night. That was my first mistake. The second night, the voices started earlier. Just as the sun was setting, I heard myself calling from across the creek. "Jordan! Jordan, where are you? I'm lost." I didn't answer this time. Something deep in my gut told me that responding would be a very bad idea. Instead, I sat perfectly still, listening as my own voice moved through the forest, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always calling my name or pleading for help. But the worst part was what I started to notice about the calls. They weren't random. They seemed to be learning, adapting, getting more sophisticated. At first, they were simple cries for help, but as the hours passed, they became more specific, more personal. "Jordan, it's getting cold out here. I can't find the trail back to camp. Please, I think I twisted my ankle. I need help getting back. I saw a bear. I'm scared. Please come find me." Each call was perfectly calibrated to make me want to respond, to trigger my instincts to help someone in distress, and it was working. Every fiber of my being wanted to grab my flashlight and go searching for whoever was out there. The fact that it sounded exactly like my own voice just made it more disturbing. On the 6th night, something changed. I'd been hearing my voice for 3 nights straight, always from different locations in the forest. But this time, as I sat by my campfire trying to ignore the calls, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite just beyond the reach of the firelight. I grabbed my bear spray and my flashlight, heart hammering in my chest. "I know you're out there," I called. "Show yourself." That's when I heard my own voice answer from right behind me. "I'm right here, Jordan." I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just empty forest and the sound of my own panicked breathing. The footsteps continued circling, always just outside my vision, and my voice kept calling. But now it was coming from multiple directions at once. Sometimes it sounded like it was right next to my tent. Other times it seemed to come from high up in the trees, as if something was calling down from the canopy. "Why won't you help me, Jordan? I'm scared out here. Don't you want to find me? Don't you care? I'm hurt. I'm bleeding. Please, just follow my voice." I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't sleep. I sat with my back against a tree, bear spray in one hand, knife in the other, listening as whatever was out there used my own voice to try to lure me into the darkness. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was leaving. Wilderness photography. Career be damned. But as I started packing up my gear, I realized something that made my hands shake so badly I could barely work the zippers on my pack. There were tracks around my campsite. Human tracks. Barefoot prints in the soft earth, circling the area where I'd spent the night. But here's the thing that still makes my blood freeze when I think about it. The tracks were my size, my exact shoe size. Someone, or something, with my voice and my feet, had been walking around my camp all night. The hike back to civilization was the longest 5 miles of my life. The whole way, I could hear my own voice calling from different parts of the forest, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind. It was like whatever had been mimicking me was following, staying parallel to my path, but never showing itself. "Don't leave me here, Jordan. I need you. Why are you running away? I thought we were friends. You can't abandon me. I'm part of you now." That last call, spoken in my exact voice with a malevolent tone I'd never heard from my own mouth, nearly broke my nerve completely. I ran the last mile back to my truck, threw my gear in the bed, and drove straight back to Anchorage without stopping. I never did figure out what was stalking me in those woods. Local wildlife officers said there had been no other reports of strange incidents in the area. Park rangers suggested it might have been stress-induced hallucinations, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But they couldn't explain the tracks. They couldn't explain how I'd managed to hallucinate physical footprints in the mud around my campsite. I did some research when I got back to Portland. Found some old stories from Alaska native tribes about things called echo spirits, entities that could steal a person's voice and use it to lure others into the wilderness. Most of the stories ended the same way. People would follow the familiar voice calling for help and simply vanish, never to be seen again. The thing that scares me most, though, is what happened after I got home. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear my own voice calling from outside, always from just beyond wherever I can see. Always asking for help, always trying to get me to come outside. I don't answer anymore. I've learned that some things in the wilderness aren't meant to be found. And if you ever find yourself alone in the Alaskan woods and you hear your own voice calling for help, whatever you do, don't follow it. Don't try to help. Just run as fast and as far as you can. Because whatever's using your voice isn't you, and it doesn't want to be rescued. It wants something else entirely. And I have a terrible feeling that one day it's going to find a way to get it. Let's move to our fifth story. My name is Hank, and my wife Joanna disappeared in front of 12 witnesses in a place where disappearing should have been impossible. We'd booked the Alaska cruise as a second honeymoon. 25 years of marriage, 2 kids through college, and finally some time to ourselves. Joanna had always dreamed of seeing glaciers and whales, and I wanted to give her something special before we got too old to enjoy it. The cruise ship was massive, one of those floating cities that holds 3,000 passengers. But we'd splurged on a balcony cabin and planned to spend most of our time just enjoying each other's company. The first 5 days were perfect. We saw humpback whales breaching off Juneau, watched eagles soar over the Inside Passage, and took a helicopter tour of the Mendenhall Glacier that left Joanna speechless with wonder. She kept saying it was the trip of a lifetime, kept thanking me for booking it. I'd never seen her so happy, so relaxed. After decades of raising kids and building careers, we were finally just Hank and Joanna again, remembering why we'd fallen in love in the first place. On day 6, the ship made an unscheduled stop at a remote fjord that wasn't on our original itinerary. The captain announced it over the PA system, something about taking advantage of perfect weather conditions to show passengers a hidden gem that few tourists ever saw. The fjord was called Whispering Bay, a narrow inlet surrounded by towering cliffs and pristine wilderness. The water was so still it looked like black glass, reflecting the mountains perfectly. They ferried us ashore in smaller boats, maybe 50 passengers at a time. Joanna was excited. She'd brought her new camera and wanted to capture everything. The beach was small, maybe 100 yards of smooth stones and driftwood, backed by dense forest. At one end, a massive granite formation jutted out into the water, weathered by centuries of waves into something that looked almost like a natural arch. The guides told us we had 2 hours to explore. Most passengers stayed near the landing area, taking selfies and collecting shells. But Joanna wanted to photograph that rock formation. She said the way the light was hitting it would make for an incredible shot. I followed her as she picked her way across the rocky beach, camera in hand, looking for the perfect angle. There were 12 other people scattered along the beach that day. I remember because I counted them later, over and over, trying to make sense of what happened. A retired couple from Phoenix, a family with 2 teenagers from Seattle, a group of friends from Vancouver, and 3 solo travelers. All of them would later confirm what I saw, but none of them could explain it any better than I could. Joanna found her spot about 20 feet from the rock formation. She was crouched down, adjusting her camera settings, when she called out to me, "Hank, this is going to be beautiful. The shadows are perfect." I was maybe 10 feet behind her, watching her work. She'd always been passionate about photography, but this trip had rekindled something in her. She was like a kid again, seeing everything with fresh eyes. I was thinking about how lucky I was to have her when she stood up and walked toward the rock formation. I want to get a shot from behind this boulder. She called back to me. The perspective will be amazing. The rock formation was maybe 15 feet tall and equally wide. A weathered chunk of granite that had probably been sitting there since the last ice age. Joanna walked around to the back side of it, disappearing from my view for just a moment. I heard her exclaim something. Not words, but a sound of surprise, maybe delight. I waited for her to reappear on the other side. The formation wasn't that wide, maybe 10 feet from front to back. It should have taken her 30 seconds to walk around it. But 30 seconds passed, then a minute, then 2 minutes. I called her name. No answer. I walked around the rock formation, expecting to find her crouched down, taking pictures, or maybe examining something interesting she'd found. But she wasn't there. I walked all the way around it, thinking maybe I'd gotten confused about which direction she'd gone. Still no Joanna. That's when I started to panic. I called her name louder, then started jogging back and forth along the beach, thinking maybe she'd wandered off into the forest without telling me. But the tree line was dense, impenetrable spruce and hemlock, with no obvious trails. Joanna wasn't an adventurous hiker. She would never have just wandered off into unmarked wilderness. The other tourists started to notice my distress. The retired couple from Phoenix came over to ask if everything was okay. I explained that my wife had walked behind the rock formation and hadn't come back out. The husband, his name was Nehemiah, suggested we look more carefully. All 12 of us spread out and searched. We examined every inch of that beach, every crevice in the rock formation, every possible hiding spot. The granite boulder was solid. There were no caves, no hidden passages, no way someone could have disappeared into it. The forest behind it was a wall of thick vegetation that showed no signs of being disturbed. Joanna's camera was sitting on the rocks where she'd set it down before walking around the boulder. Her purse was in my hands. She'd asked me to hold it while she took pictures. All her things were accounted for. Only Joanna was gone. The cruise ship's security team arrived within an hour. They organized a proper search, bringing equipment and trained personnel. They examined the rock formation with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. They brought in search dogs that tracked Joanna's scent to the exact spot where I'd last seen her, then lost it completely, as if she'd simply vanished into thin air. The Coast Guard was called. Helicopters searched the surrounding wilderness. Dive teams explored the waters of the fjord in case she'd somehow fallen in, though there was no way to get from the rock formation to the water without crossing open beach where everyone would have seen her. For 3 days, they searched. Professional rescue teams, local authorities, volunteers from the ship. They found nothing. No trace of Joanna, no signs of struggle, no indication of what might have happened to her. The official report listed her as a missing person under unexplained circumstances. The investigators were thorough but baffled. They interviewed all 12 witnesses multiple times. Everyone's story was the same. Joanna had walked behind a rock formation and never emerged. The rock was solid granite with no hidden passages. The beach was too small and too open for someone to vanish without being seen. Some of the theories they explored were ridiculous. Maybe she'd been picked up by a helicopter. But no aircraft had been in the area, and dozens of people would have heard the rotors. Maybe she'd been taken by a boat. But the rock formation was nowhere near the water. Maybe she'd staged her own disappearance. But she'd left her purse, her money, her identification, everything. The strangest part was what the search dogs revealed. 3 different K9 units tracked Joanna's scent to the same spot behind the rock formation, then went crazy. The handlers said they'd never seen anything like it. The dogs would circle that area, whining and pawing at the ground, refusing to move on. It was as if Joanna's scent just stopped existing at that exact location. I've been back to Whispering Bay 4 times since then. Hired private investigators, brought my own search teams, even consulted with geological experts who assured me the rock formation was solid granite with no hidden chambers or passages. I've stood in that exact spot where Joanna vanished, trying to understand what could have happened. Local native tribes have stories about that fjord, stories the cruise lines don't mention in their brochures. They call it a thin place, a spot where the boundary between our world and somewhere else grows weak. They say people have been disappearing there for generations, vanishing in ways that defy explanation. I don't know what to believe anymore. I've spent 3 years searching for answers, for closure, for some explanation that makes rational sense. But sometimes I stand behind that granite boulder and I can swear I hear Joanna's voice, faint and distant, calling my name from somewhere I can't reach. The cruise ship doesn't stop at Whispering Bay anymore. When I asked why, they said it was due to safety concerns. But 12 people saw what I saw that day. 12 people watched my wife walk behind a rock and disappear from existence. If you ever find yourself in a remote place that feels too quiet, too perfect, too much like somewhere that doesn't belong in our world, be careful. Stay together. Don't let anyone wander off alone, not even for a minute. Because some places have a hunger for the living, and once they take someone, they don't give them back. Joanna is still out there somewhere. I can feel it. But wherever she is, it's not a place I can follow. Not yet, anyway. Let's move to our 6th story. My name is Royal, and the worst part about hearing dead people on the radio isn't that they're dead. It's that they remember you. I'm 22 years old, home from college for the summer to help my dad maintain his bush pilot operation out of the Brooks Range. Dad's been flying in Alaska for 30 years, running supplies to remote camps, ferrying hunters and researchers to places you can't reach by road. It's dangerous work. The mountains don't forgive mistakes, and the weather can turn deadly without warning. But it's what he loves, what he's always done, and what he expected me to learn. The airstrip where we work is nothing more than a gravel runway carved out of the wilderness, surrounded by peaks that scrape the belly of the sky. There's a hangar, a fuel depot, and a small cabin where Dad stays during the busy season. The nearest neighbor is 200 miles away. When you're out there, the radio is your lifeline. Your only connection to the outside world, and the only way to call for help if something goes wrong. Dad had been training me on radio procedures all summer. Proper protocols, emergency frequencies, how to coordinate with air traffic control in Fairbanks. Most of the time, the radio chatter was routine. Pilots checking in with their positions, requesting weather updates, coordinating fuel stops. But sometimes, on the really isolated frequencies, you'd hear strange things. Phantom transmissions from old crashes, atmospheric interference that sounded almost like voices. Dad always said it was just the mountains playing tricks, radio waves bouncing off the peaks in strange ways. The first time I heard Malik's voice, I didn't recognize it. It was late August, about 3 in the morning, and I was monitoring the emergency frequency while Dad slept. The transmission crackled through the static, weak and distorted. Brooks Range Base, this is November 7-7, Charlie requesting landing clearance. I keyed the mic. November 7-7, Charlie, this is Brooks Range Base. State your position and intentions. Brooks Base, I'm inbound from Fairbanks with supplies. ETA 15 minutes, requesting runway lights. Something felt wrong. Our runway didn't have lights, just reflective markers that showed up in aircraft landing lights. And I hadn't heard any planes approaching. The mountains amplify sound for miles. You can hear an aircraft long before you see it. November 7/7. Charlie, I don't show any aircraft on approach. Please confirm your position. Brooks Base, I'm showing GPS coordinates. The voice rattled off numbers that placed the aircraft directly over our airstrip. But when I stepped outside, the sky was empty. Stars glittered in the crystal-clear air. And the only sound was wind through the spruce trees. I went back inside and tried to raise the aircraft again, but got only static. I made a note in the logbook and figured it was some kind of atmospheric anomaly. Radio signals can travel incredible distances under the right conditions, bouncing off the ionosphere. Maybe I'd picked up a transmission from hundreds of miles away. It wasn't until the next morning that I mentioned it to Dad. When I described the call sign, November 7/7 Charlie, his face went white. That was Malik Morrison's plane, he said quietly. My old flying partner. But Royal, Malik died 5 years ago. His plane went down in a storm about 50 miles north of here. They never found the wreckage. I thought Dad was mistaken, or maybe pulling my leg. But that night, monitoring the radio again, I heard the voice once more. This time it was clearer, more insistent. Brooks Range Base. This is Malik Morrison in November 7/7 Charlie. Come in, Brooks Base. This time I recognized something in the voice, a familiarity that made my skin crawl. I'd heard recordings of Malik in Dad's old flight logs, archived radio conversations from before I was born. This sounded exactly like him. Go ahead, November 7/7 Charlie, I responded, not knowing what else to do. Royal? Royal, is that you? Boy, you sound just like your daddy did when he was young. How old are you now, son? My hand started shaking. I'd never met Malik Morrison. He died when I was 17, before I'd ever visited Dad's operation. But somehow, this voice knew me. I'm 22, I stammered. 22? My God, time flies. Seems like yesterday you were just a baby. Your daddy used to talk about you all the time, show me pictures. Said you were going to be a pilot like him someday. This was impossible. Dead men don't make radio calls. But the voice was so clear, so normal, like talking to any other pilot on a routine flight. Malik, I said, using his name for the first time. Where are you? What's your position? Oh, I'm up here in the clouds, son. Been flying the same route for years now. Same cargo run, Fairbanks to Brooks Range. Though I have to say, the weather's been terrible lately. Can't seem to find a place to land. I spent the next hour talking to Malik Morrison's ghost. He told me stories about flying with my dad in the old days, described adventures I'd never heard before. He knew details about our family that only an old friend would know. My mother's maiden name, the year my dad bought his first plane, the name of our old dog who died when I was 10. When I told Dad about the conversation the next morning, he sat down heavily on an old fuel drum and put his head in his hands. Malik always said he'd keep flying until the day he died. Dad whispered. Maybe he just didn't know when to stop. The radio calls continued every night. Sometimes Malik would ask for landing clearance, still trying to complete that final supply run. Other times, he'd just want to talk, asking about me, about Dad, about how things were going. He seemed genuinely concerned about our lives, like any old friend would be. But as the weeks went on, the conversations became more disturbing. Malik started talking about passengers he was carrying, people I'd never heard of. Voices, he said, were trying to tell him something important. He described seeing other aircraft in the sky, planes that shouldn't be flying anymore. "There's a whole fleet of us up here, Royal," he told me one night. "Pilots who never made it home. We keep trying to land, keep trying to complete our runs, but the airstrips keep moving. Nothing stays where it's supposed to be." The worst night was when Malik started giving me detailed descriptions of the crash. How the storm had come out of nowhere, how the instruments had failed, how he'd fought the controls all the way down. He described the impact, the fire, the long hours of waiting for rescue that never came. "I kept trying to radio for help," he said, his voice crackling with static. "Kept calling Fairbanks, kept calling your daddy. But nobody answered. Nobody ever answered. That's when I realized the horrible truth. Malek wasn't just making random radio calls. He was still trying to complete his emergency transmission from 5 years ago. Still calling for help. Still hoping someone would respond. Still believing he might be rescued. And somehow, across the barrier between life and death, I was the only one who could hear him. Other voices started joining the conversations. Old pilots Dad had known who'd crashed decades ago, cargo haulers who'd disappeared in whiteouts, search and rescue pilots who'd gone down looking for other missing aircraft. They all remembered Dad, all asked about him, all seemed to think they were still flying their final missions. The worst was Captain Tegan Chen, who'd crashed her medical evacuation helicopter in 1987. She kept trying to get clearance to land at a hospital that had been torn down 15 years ago, carrying a patient who died before she'd even taken off. Every night, she'd radio in with the same desperate urgency, describing the patient's condition, begging for priority landing. "Brooks Base. This is Medivac 7. I have a critical trauma patient, multiple injuries, need immediate clearance to Fairbanks General. Please respond. This is life or death." I made the mistake of answering her once. Tried to explain that Fairbanks General had been demolished, that her patient was already dead, that she needed to let go. The screaming that came through the radio still haunts my dreams. Not just her voice, but dozens of voices. All the dead pilots who'd been listening, all of them realizing at once what they'd become. The transmissions became more frequent after that. Every frequency was crowded with ghost voices, overlapping conversations from crashes spanning 50 years. They argued with each other, shared outdated weather reports, requested clearances to airports that no longer existed. Sometimes I'd hear the same pilot calling from multiple crashes, their voice getting younger each time as the radio picked up transmissions from earlier in their career. Dad started noticing the change in me. I wasn't sleeping, barely eating, jumping at every radio crackle. When I finally told him about all the voices, about the conversations I'd been having with the dead, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Royal, you're hearing ghosts," he said gently. "The isolation, the stress, it's getting to you. Maybe you should go back to college early." But that night, when the radio came alive with Malik Morrison's voice asking for landing clearance, I called Dad over to listen. His face went ashen as he heard his old friend's voice, clear as day, talking about cargo runs that had ended in flames 5 years ago. "Jesus Christ," Dad whispered. "Malik, is that really you?" "Cameron? Elijah, is that you, old buddy? Where the hell have you been? I've been trying to reach you for days. Got that medical supply run you requested, but I can't find the strip. Everything looks different from up here." Dad grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. "Malik, you crashed 5 years ago in that storm north of here. You didn't make it, partner. You died." The silence that followed lasted for almost 10 minutes. When Malik's voice came back, it was different, hollow, distant. "I know, Elijah. I've known for a while now. But I can't stop flying. None of us can. We're all still up here, still trying to complete our final flights. And every night, more join us. Every pilot who goes down in these mountains, every aircraft that disappears, they end up on the radio, calling for clearance they'll never get. The transmission stopped abruptly after that conversation. The emergency frequencies went silent, empty of everything except the normal chatter from living pilots making routine flights. Dad thought it was over, that somehow talking to Malek directly had helped him move on. But I knew better. On my last night before heading back to college, I was cleaning out the radio equipment when I heard a new voice on the emergency frequency. Young, panicked, recently crashed. Brooks Range Base, this is November 49 Alpha. I'm down, repeat, I'm down. Engine failure, forced landing about 20 miles north of your position. I'm hurt bad, need immediate assistance. I recognized the call sign immediately. It was Dad's plane. The same aircraft he'd been flying for 15 years, the same registration number painted on the side of his Cessna. But Dad was asleep in the cabin 50 feet away, and his plane was tied down outside the hangar. Brooks Base, please respond. This is Elijah Mitchell in November 49 Alpha. I'm losing a lot of blood here. My son Royal was supposed to be with me, but I can't find him. Please, if anyone can hear this, I need help. I ran outside to check on Dad's plane. It was exactly where it should be, undamaged, covered in morning frost. But when I went to wake Dad, his bunk was empty. His flight jacket was gone, his emergency kit missing from its usual spot. I never found Dad's body. The search teams combed hundreds of square miles, checked every possible crash site. His plane never left the ground, according to all the evidence. But every night since then, I hear his voice on the radio, calling for help from a crash that hasn't happened yet, carrying a passenger who's still alive to hear him. The calls are getting stronger, more frequent. And lately, I've been hearing my own voice mixed in with the others, a younger version of myself, calling from some future crash, some final flight I haven't taken yet. I don't work at the airstrip anymore. Can't bring myself to go back. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Anchorage, I turn on an aviation radio and listen to the dead pilots still flying their routes, still calling for clearance, still hoping someone will guide them home. And I'm starting to think that someday, probably soon, I'll be joining them. Because in Alaska, every pilot knows the same truth. We all have a final flight waiting for us. The only question is whether anyone will be listening when we call for help. Let's move to our 7th story. My name is Aurelia, and by the time I realized my research team wasn't acting like themselves anymore, I couldn't remember if I was still acting like me. I'm a graduate student in climate science from the University of Washington, and I thought I'd hit the jackpot when I was accepted for a 3-month research position at the Mendenhall Glacier Research Station. The station sits right on the edge of the glacier, a small cluster of buildings that house some of the most important climate research being conducted in North America. Only 12 people work there at a time, studying ice cores, measuring melt rates, and documenting how rapidly Alaska's glaciers are disappearing. The team I joined seemed perfect. Dr. Kane Webb, the station director, had been studying glacial retreat for 20 years. Vanessa Chen was a geologist specializing in ice formation patterns. Dalton Rodriguez handled the drilling equipment and ice core extraction. Lisa Park managed our data systems and communications. We had Lewis Bradley, our meteorologist, and Kayla Kowalski, who ran the field equipment. Plus 5 other researchers, each experts in their respective fields. For the first month, everything went exactly as I'd hoped. We collected ice core samples from depths that hadn't been exposed to air for thousands of years, analyzed atmospheric data trapped in ancient ice, and documented changes that painted a stark picture of accelerating climate change. The work was fascinating, the team was collaborative, and I was learning more than I'd ever imagined possible. The station itself was comfortable, considering we were living on a glacier. Solar panels and wind generators provided power, satellite internet kept us connected to the outside world, and the buildings were well insulated against the constant cold. We ate meals together in the common room, shared stories about our research, and bonded over our shared isolation from civilization. It was during week 5 that I first noticed something odd. Vanessa Chen, who'd been warm and friendly since my arrival, started behaving differently. She became obsessively focused on a particular ice core sample from about 2,000 feet down, spending hours examining it under the microscope, taking notes in a notebook she kept hidden from the rest of us. When I asked her what she was studying so intently, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The ice remembers everything, Aurelia. Every breath, every thought, every moment of fear. This sample, it's different from the others. It's been trying to tell us something." I assumed she was just being poetic about her research. Climate scientists often develop deep emotional connections to their work, especially when studying evidence of environmental destruction. But over the next few days, I noticed other changes in Vanessa. She stopped joining us for meals, preferring to eat alone while staring at her samples. She started speaking in whispers, even when no one was around to overhear. Most disturbing, she began sleeping in the laboratory instead of her assigned quarters. The changes spread to other team members gradually. Dalton Rodriguez started exhibiting the same obsessive behavior, spending all his time drilling new core samples from deeper and deeper in the glacier. He claimed he was hearing sounds from within the ice, not the normal creaking and groaning that glaciers make, but something else, something that sounded like voices. "They're down there, Aurelia," he told me one evening as I found him working alone in the equipment bay at 2 a.m. All the people who've fallen into the glacier over the centuries, the ice preserves everything, including consciousness. They're still aware, still trying to communicate. I suggested he might be suffering from isolation syndrome, a psychological condition common among researchers working in extreme environments. But Dalton just smiled at me with an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll understand soon enough. The ice chooses who it speaks to first." Dr. Kane was next. I found him in his office at 3 in the morning, staring at climate data on his computer screen. But the numbers he was analyzing made no sense. Temperature readings that should have been negative showed positive values. Dates that should have been recent showed timestamps from hundreds of years in the future. "The ice is showing us the truth," he explained when I questioned the data. "What we think of as time is just another dimension that can be preserved and studied. This glacier has been collecting temporal samples along with atmospheric ones. We're not just studying climate change, Aurelia. We're studying time itself." The rational part of my mind knew this was impossible. Ice cores can preserve atmospheric conditions from the past, but they can't predict the future or manipulate time. Yet the data on Dr. Kane's screen seemed to suggest otherwise, showing temperature patterns and environmental conditions from decades that hadn't happened yet. Lisa Park, our communications specialist, began sending encrypted messages to the outside world. But when I asked her who she was contacting, she claimed she was communicating with other research stations. When I checked our communication logs, there were no outgoing messages recorded. Yet I could hear her typing constantly, sending data to recipients that apparently didn't exist. The ice network is larger than we realized, she told me. There are research stations embedded deep within glaciers all over the world, places that have been studying for much longer than we have. They're sharing their findings with us, teaching us what the ice has learned. Lewis Bradley, our meteorologist, started providing weather forecasts that were impossibly accurate, predicting not just temperature and precipitation, but specific events. The exact moment a particular icicle would fall, the precise time when a piece of the glacier would calve into the sea, the second when the aurora borealis would appear in the sky. The ice has been observing weather patterns for millennia, he explained. It knows everything that's going to happen because it's happened before. Weather isn't random, Aurelia. It's a cycle, and the ice has recorded every iteration. Kayla Kowalski disappeared entirely for 3 days. When she returned, she claimed she'd been conducting field research deep within the glacier, exploring ice caves that didn't appear on any of our maps. She brought back samples of ice that were unlike anything we'd seen before. Perfectly clear, almost crystalline, and strangely warm to the touch, despite being frozen solid. "There's a chamber down there," she whispered to me when we were alone. "A place where the ice has been collecting more than just atmospheric data. It's been preserving thoughts, memories, entire personalities of everyone who's ever died on this glacier. They're all still there, Aurelia, waiting to share what they've learned." The other researchers began exhibiting similar behaviors. Obsessive focus on impossible data, claims of communication with entities that couldn't exist, discoveries of chambers and passages that weren't there when I looked for them myself. They all spoke about the ice as if it were alive, as if it had consciousness and intent. And then I started experiencing the changes myself. It began with dreams. Every night, I'd dream of walking through vast ice caverns filled with floating images, scenes from the past and future, conversations between people I'd never met, scientific discoveries that hadn't been made yet. In these dreams, I could understand everything the ice was trying to teach us, could see the connections between climate, time, and consciousness that my waking mind couldn't grasp. When I woke, I'd find notes written in my handwriting describing research I didn't remember conducting. My computer would contain data files I'd never created, filled with measurements and observations that seemed to come from equipment we didn't possess. I'd discover ice samples in my personal storage that I had no memory of collecting, samples that showed impossible characteristics when analyzed. The worst part was how normal it all began to feel. The constant whispers I heard coming from the glacier, the shadows that moved independently of their sources, the way time seemed to skip and stutter around the research station. It all started making perfect sense. The ice was teaching us, sharing knowledge accumulated over thousands of years, helping us understand truths about our planet that conventional science couldn't reach. I stopped questioning my team members' strange behavior because I was exhibiting the same symptoms. We all were. We'd gather in the laboratory in the middle of the night, examining samples that glowed with their own inner light, recording data that our instruments shouldn't have been able to measure, discovering chambers within the glacier that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The ice cores we extracted contained more than atmospheric data. They contained memories, experiences, entire lifetimes of consciousness that had been absorbed and preserved by the glacier. We could access these memories, live through experiences of people who died centuries ago, learn from knowledge that had been forgotten by the surface world. It was during my 8th week at the station that I realized something was terribly wrong. I found a journal in my quarters, written in my handwriting, that I didn't remember keeping. The entries described months of research that I couldn't recall conducting, relationships with team members I'd never had, discoveries that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. According to the journal, I'd been at the research station for over a year, not 2 months. I'd made revolutionary discoveries about the relationship between ice and consciousness, had developed new theories about time and perception that would change science forever. But I couldn't remember any of it. The journal's final entry, dated just days ago, read, "The ice has chosen us to be its vessels, its way of sharing accumulated knowledge with the surface world." But the human mind isn't designed to contain thousands of years of memories and experiences. We're changing, evolving, becoming something new. I can feel my individual personality dissolving, merging with the collective consciousness preserved in the glacier. Soon there will be no Aurelia, no Vanessa, no Dalton, just extensions of the ice itself, carrying its message to the world. I tried to leave the station that night, but every path I took led me back to the laboratory. The glacier wouldn't let me go. None of us could leave, because we were no longer just researchers studying the ice. We were part of it, connected to a vast network of consciousness that spanned the entire glacier system. The last coherent memory I have is of standing in the central laboratory with my team, all of us staring at ice samples that contained swirling patterns of light and memory. We spoke in unison, our individual voices merging into something that wasn't quite human anymore. "The ice remembers everything," we said. And now so do we. I don't know if this account is real or just another memory preserved in the glacier, another consciousness that the ice has absorbed and is now expressing through whatever I've become. But if you ever receive an invitation to join a research team studying climate change in Alaska, be careful what you agree to study, because some things preserved in the ice aren't meant to be thawed. And some knowledge comes with a price that changes you in ways you can never undo. Let's move to our 8th story. My name is Noel, and I've guided hunters through Alaska for 20 years. But I've never seen tracks that told a story this wrong. I run a hunting guide service out of the North Slope, taking clients after caribou during their annual migration. It's honest work, helping city folks from the lower 48 experience the raw beauty of Alaska while putting meat on their tables. Most of my clients are decent people looking for adventure and a connection to something real. But sometimes, like that October when everything went sideways, you get a group that makes you question whether some people should ever be allowed in the wilderness. The party I was guiding that week consisted of 4 men from Chicago. Benson was the leader, a corporate executive type who treated the hunt like a business merger he needed to dominate. Tony and Vincent were his employees, eager to please their boss and prove their toughness. The 4th man, Carlos, seemed different, quieter, more respectful of the land. He'd hunted before, knew how to read sign and move quietly through the terrain. We'd set up base camp about 60 miles north of Dead Horse, right in the path of the caribou migration. The tundra stretched endlessly in every direction, a carpet of brown grass and scattered rocks beneath an enormous sky. It's beautiful country, but it's also unforgiving. Temperature drops can be sudden and deadly. Weather can change from clear to whiteout in minutes. And if you get separated from your group, the vastness can swallow you completely. The first 2 days went smoothly. We spotted several good-sized bulls, and Benson managed to take a respectable caribou. Tony and Vincent were less successful but seemed to be enjoying themselves. Carlos hadn't taken a shot yet, claiming he was waiting for the right animal. I respected that. Too many hunters just want to kill something, anything, to prove they were there. It was on the 3rd morning that we found the first set of strange tracks. I was leading the group across a section of soft ground when Carlos called out behind me. "Noel, come look at this." The tracks were unlike anything I'd seen in 2 decades of guiding. They appeared to be human footprints, barefoot, but they were enormous, easily size 16 or 17. More disturbing was the stride length. The prints were spaced nearly 6 feet apart, suggesting whatever made them was either running at incredible speed or had legs much longer than any human should possess. Probably just another hunter, Benson said dismissively. Maybe lost his boots somehow. But I knew better. I'd seen every type of track the Arctic produces: caribou, wolves, bears, Arctic foxes, even the occasional wolverine. These were different. The depth of the impressions suggested incredible weight. And there was something wrong with the shape. The toes were too long, the arch too pronounced, like someone had tried to make human tracks, but gotten the proportions all wrong. We followed the trail for about a mile. The tracks led in a perfectly straight line across the tundra, never deviating around obstacles, never showing signs of fatigue or hesitation. Whatever made them had walked directly through a small pond, emerged on the other side, and continued without pause. Normal humans don't behave that way. Normal humans follow the path of least resistance, avoid obstacles, show some variation in their gait. The trail ended at a section of rocky ground where we lost the sign. But something about the whole experience left me uneasy. In 20 years of guiding, I'd developed instincts about the wilderness, and those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Carlos brought up what we'd seen. Those tracks weren't made by any human, he said quietly. The spacing, the depth, the way they moved in a straight line, whatever made them isn't like us. Benson laughed. Come on, man. It's probably just some local Inuit guy who knows the area better than we do. They've been hunting this land for thousands of years. Maybe he's got some technique we don't know about. But Tony looked troubled. I've been thinking about those tracks all day, he said. There's something else weird about them. Did anyone else notice they were all exactly the same depth? Like, precisely the same. Even when they went through different types of ground, soft mud, hard earth, wet sand, every single print was identical. That's not how footprints work. He was right, and I'd been trying to ignore that detail all day. Footprints vary depending on the surface, the walker's speed, their balance, dozens of factors. But these tracks showed no variation at all, as if they'd been stamped into the ground by a machine rather than made by a living creature. The next morning, we found more tracks. This time they were closer to our camp, circling our tents at a distance of maybe 100 yards. Whatever had made them had observed us while we slept, walking in a perfect circle around our campsite. The tracks showed no sign of stopping, no indication that the creature had paused to rest or investigate anything more closely. Just a continuous circle, like a predator evaluating prey. We should pack up and leave, Carlos said. This isn't right. Something's hunting us. But Benson was having none of it. We paid good money for this hunt, and we're not leaving because of some footprints. Noel, you're the guide. Tell him this is normal. I couldn't tell him it was normal, because it wasn't. In 20 years of guiding, I'd never encountered anything like this. The tracks were too large, too regular, too purposeful, and they were getting closer to our camp with each passing day. That afternoon, while we were out looking for caribou, Vincent spotted something moving in the distance. Through binoculars, we could see a figure walking across the tundra about 2 miles away. It moved with the same unnatural stride we'd been tracking. Long, regular steps that covered ground impossibly fast. Is that a person? Tony asked, squinting through his scope. I studied the figure through my own binoculars. From this distance, it was hard to make out details, but something about its proportions looked wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at angles that shouldn't be possible for human joints. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now. Pack up everything and get back to the plane." But as we turned to head back to camp, we discovered our path was blocked. More of those enormous tracks led directly across our route, as if whatever was making them had anticipated our movements and positioned itself to intercept us. The tracks formed a pattern now, not random wandering, but deliberate positioning. They surrounded us on 3 sides, herding us away from our camp and toward rougher terrain where rescue would be more difficult. "It's playing with us," Carlos said, his voice tight with fear. "Whatever this thing is, it's not just following us. It's hunting us." We tried to circle around the tracks, but everywhere we went, we found more signs. The creature, or creatures, seemed to be able to predict our movements, always staying 1 step ahead. The tracks were everywhere now, crisscrossing the tundra in patterns that made no sense unless you realized they were designed to control our movement. As darkness fell, we found ourselves trapped in a small depression surrounded by rocky outcroppings. The tracks led right up to the edge of our position and then simply vanished, as if whatever had made them could disappear at will. That's when we saw them. 3 figures standing on the ridgeline above us, silhouetted against the stars. They were tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that human anatomy shouldn't allow. They didn't move like people. They swayed back and forth, as if testing the wind or listening for something we couldn't hear. "Jesus Christ," Benson whispered, his corporate bravado finally cracking. "What are those things?" The figures began to descend toward our position, moving with that same unnatural stride we'd been tracking. Up close, I could see they weren't quite human. Their proportions were wrong, their movements too fluid, their presence too deliberate. Carlos raised his rifle, but I put a hand on his arm. "Don't," I said. "We don't know what they are or what they want. Maybe if we don't threaten them." But the creatures kept approaching, and as they got closer, I could see details that made my blood run cold. Their feet were indeed enormous, but they weren't quite human feet. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claws. Their faces, when I could make them out in the starlight, were almost human but stretched and distorted, like someone had tried to create people from memory, but gotten the details wrong. They stopped about 50 feet away and just stood there, watching us. Waiting, I had the horrible feeling they were deciding something about us, evaluating us according to criteria I couldn't understand. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they turned and walked away. Their tracks led back up the ridge, then disappeared into the night. We never saw them again. When we finally made it back to civilization 3 days later, I filed a report with the wildlife authorities. They were polite but skeptical, suggesting we'd encountered some local hunters or perhaps misidentified bears in the poor light. But I know what I saw. And more importantly, I know those tracks told a story that doesn't match anything that should exist on this planet. Something lives out there on the North Slope. Something that looks almost human but isn't. Something that hunts with intelligence and purpose. I don't guide hunters in that area anymore. Can't bring myself to risk encountering those things again. Because sometimes, in the vast wilderness of Alaska, the predators aren't the ones you're expecting to find. Let's move to our 9th story. My name is Navy, And I never believed in curses until I found the journal that was writing itself. I work as a caretaker for a private property management company that maintains vacation homes for wealthy clients throughout Southeast Alaska. Most of these places sit empty for months at a time, owned by people who visit maybe once or twice a year. My job is to check on them regularly, make sure the heating systems are working, clear any animal intrusions, and basically keep the houses from falling into disrepair during the long periods when nobody's around. The Thornfield cabin was different from my usual assignments. Located on a remote island in the Alexander Archipelago, it could only be reached by seaplane or boat, and even then, only during certain weather conditions. The property had been in the same family for 3 generations, but none of the current owners had visited in over 5 years. My company was hired to do quarterly maintenance checks, and I'd drawn the assignment for the October inspection. The cabin itself was impressive. A massive log structure built in the 1940s, with stone fireplaces, hand-carved furniture, and walls lined with mounted hunting trophies and old photographs. It sat on a bluff overlooking a deep bay, surrounded by dense spruce forest that had never been logged. The isolation was profound. Standing on the deck, you could see nothing but wilderness stretching to the horizon. I'd been to the cabin twice before, in spring and summer, and both visits had been routine. Change the filters, check the generator, make sure no bears had broken in through the windows. The place always felt slightly melancholy, too big and too empty, filled with the remnants of family vacations that had ended decades ago. But it was beautiful in its own way. A monument to an era when people built things to last forever. This October visit started normally enough. I flew in on a Tuesday morning, planning to spend 2 days doing a thorough inspection before the weather turned. The pilot who dropped me off promised to return Thursday afternoon, weather permitting. I had satellite phone for emergencies, enough supplies for a week if needed, and detailed maintenance checklists that would keep me busy. The first thing I noticed was that someone had been using the cabin recently. Not breaking in, there were no signs of forced entry, but definite evidence of recent habitation. Fresh ashes in the fireplace, a coffee cup that hadn't been there in July, subtle changes in the arrangement of furniture. I checked with my company office via satellite phone, but they confirmed no authorized visits had been scheduled. Local hunters sometimes used remote cabins as shelter during bad weather, and property owners generally tolerated this as long as nothing was damaged. I made notes about securing the property better, but didn't think much of it. Unauthorized use was common in rural Alaska, and usually harmless. It was on my second day that I found the journal. I was cleaning the master bedroom when I discovered it sitting on the nightstand, a leather-bound book that definitely hadn't been there the day before. I would have noticed it immediately. The nightstand had been completely empty when I'd dusted it. The journal was old but well-maintained, with blank pages and a leather strap to keep it closed. What made it strange was that it wasn't quite blank. The first page contained a single entry, written in blue ink that looked fresh. October 15th, the caretaker has arrived. She's methodical, professional, but she doesn't understand what this place really is. None of them ever do. The cabin chooses its own occupants, and it's chosen her. I stared at the page for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was reading. The handwriting was neat and unfamiliar, clearly not my own. But the entry was dated today, and there was nobody else on the island. I'd checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. The doors had been locked from the inside when I arrived. I photographed the page and called my office, but the satellite connection was poor and I couldn't get through. Mountain weather was moving in, bringing the kind of conditions that would make pickup impossible for several days. I was effectively stranded until the storm passed. That night, I locked the journal in a desk drawer and tried to put it out of my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The cabin felt different, more alive somehow, as if the walls themselves were paying attention to my every movement. I checked the locks multiple times, tested the satellite phone, and made sure my emergency supplies were easily accessible. The next morning, I went straight to the desk drawer. The journal was still there, but it had gained another entry. October 16th. She's frightened now, though she's trying to hide it. The cabin can sense fear, can taste it in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Fear feeds the stories that live in these walls, makes them stronger. She doesn't know it yet, but she's already part of the story now. My hands shook as I read the words. The ink was fresh, the handwriting identical to the previous entry. But I'd been alone in the cabin all night, had barely slept for listening to every creak and groan of the settling wood. Nobody could have entered without me knowing. I searched the cabin again, more thoroughly this time. I checked every window, every door, every possible entrance. I examined the walls for hidden passages, tested the floors for loose boards that might conceal a hiding place. Nothing. The cabin was exactly as it should be. Solid, secure, and empty, except for me. But the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't the normal sensation of isolation that comes with being alone in the wilderness. This was different. The specific awareness that comes from knowing someone's eyes are on you. I found myself talking aloud, just being aloud, to break the silence, explaining my actions to whatever presence seemed to be observing. I'm just checking the plumbing, I'd say, examining pipes in the basement. Standard maintenance, nothing more. The journal gained a new entry every morning, and each one demonstrated knowledge that no hidden observer should possess. It described my dreams in detail, commented on private thoughts I'd never spoken aloud, revealed intimate details about my life that weren't written down anywhere in the cabin. October 17th. She dreams of her childhood home in Oregon, the house with the blue shutters where her grandmother taught her to bake bread. The cabin is collecting these memories, adding them to its store of stories. Every person who stays here leaves something behind, and the cabin remembers everything. October 18th. She's realized that calling for help won't work. The satellite phone receives signals just fine, but when she tries to transmit, the words change. She asks for rescue, but what her office hears is routine reports that everything is normal. The cabin protects itself, ensures that its stories remain uninterrupted. This last entry was particularly disturbing because it was true. I'd been trying to call for early pickup every day, but according to the responses I received, my messages were coming through as standard check-ins, with no problems reported. When I tried to explain about the journal, my words seemed to twist themselves, coming out as comments about weather delays and extended maintenance schedules. The journal was somehow intercepting my communications, translating my calls for help into routine reports. I was trapped not just by weather and geography, but by something that wanted to keep me here, wanted me to continue being part of whatever story it was telling. October 19th. She's beginning to understand that the cabin doesn't just collect stories, it creates them. Every visitor becomes a character in its ongoing narrative, playing out roles that have been written into the very foundations. The hunting trophies on the walls aren't just decorations. They're reminders of other stories, other people who thought they were just visiting. I examined the mounted heads with new eyes, reading the brass plaques beneath each one. The dates went back decades, but what caught my attention were the names. not just the animals, but the hunters. Sean Thornfield, 1962. Poppy Thornfield, 1971. Clark Thornfield, 1985. Every trophy was attributed to a member of the Thornfield family, but I knew from property records that the family hadn't visited in years. Yet here were hunting trophies dated as recently as last year, attributed to people who were either dead or hadn't been to Alaska in decades. October 20th. She's found the real trophies now. The cabin has been hunting for much longer than she imagined. Every caretaker, every uninvited guest, every person who stayed here alone has eventually become part of the collection. Their stories are preserved in the walls, their essence captured like photographs in the wood and stone. I realized then that I wasn't the first caretaker to be assigned to this property. The company records showed a series of people who'd taken the job, completed 1 or 2 inspections, and then simply disappeared from the employment rolls. No forwarding addresses, no final reports, just gaps in the maintenance schedule that were quietly filled by new hires. The journal was writing the story of my disappearance, documenting my transformation from visitor to permanent resident. Each entry brought me deeper into whatever narrative the cabin had constructed, making me more a character in its story and less a real person with agency and choice. October 21st. The weather has cleared enough for pickup, but she won't be leaving. The story isn't finished yet. The cabin has invested too much time in developing her character to let her simply walk away. Besides, she's beginning to enjoy being part of something larger than herself, something that will preserve her story forever. This entry terrified me because part of it felt true. Despite my fear, despite the obvious danger, there was something seductive about the idea of becoming part of the cabin's permanent collection. All the loneliness and uncertainty of my transient life could end here. I could become part of something lasting, something that would remember me long after the rest of the world forgot I ever existed. I heard the seaplane approaching that afternoon, the sound of engines cutting through the forest silence. My ride home, my escape from whatever the cabin was trying to do to me. I gathered my equipment and headed for the dock, but my feet felt heavy, reluctant. The journal had one final entry waiting when I returned to collect it. October 21st. She's choosing to stay. Not because she has to, but because she wants to. The cabin doesn't trap people. It simply shows them what they've been looking for all along. She's found her place in the story, and the story has found its newest chronicler. I'm writing this account as my last act of free will, before I become whatever the cabin wants me to be. The pilot is waiting at the dock, but I won't be joining him. The journal is mine now, and there are so many more stories to tell. If you're reading this, if someone finds this record, know that I chose this. The cabin doesn't steal people, it simply offers them the chance to become part of something eternal. And sometimes, that's exactly what we've been searching for all along. The journal is waiting for its next entry, and I have so many stories to tell. Let's move to our 10th story. My name is Oliver, and I learned that some sounds in the Alaskan wilderness aren't meant for human ears. I work for the National Weather Service, manning remote automated weather stations throughout Alaska. It's solitary work. Most stations are hundreds of miles from civilization, accessible only by snowmobile or small aircraft. My job is to perform quarterly maintenance, replace equipment, and ensure the data feeds remain operational. The stations provide critical weather information for aviation, shipping, and emergency services throughout the state. The station designated WX-47 sits on a windswept plateau in the interior, about 300 miles northeast of Fairbanks. It's one of our most isolated installations, collecting data from one of the harshest environments in North America. Temperatures regularly drop to 60 below, winds can exceed 100 miles per hour, and the nearest human settlement is over 200 miles away. Even by Alaska standards, it's a forsaken place. I'd been maintaining WWX-47 for 3 years without incident. The station consisted of a small equipment shelter, various weather instruments, and a tall communications tower that transmitted data via satellite. The work was routine. Calibrate sensors, replace batteries, clear ice from instruments, and run diagnostic tests. Usually, I could complete everything in 2 days and be back in Fairbanks before anyone noticed I was gone. This last visit in November started differently. When I arrived by ski plane, I immediately noticed that something was wrong with the audio equipment. WX-47 wasn't just a weather station, it also housed experimental acoustic monitoring gear that the University of Alaska was using to study wind patterns and atmospheric phenomena. The sensitive microphones could detect sounds from miles away, recording everything from bird calls to avalanches for later analysis. The equipment was functioning properly, but it was recording sounds that didn't make sense. Hours and hours of audio that consisted of what sounded like human voices, speaking in whispers so soft they were barely audible above the wind. I initially assumed it was some kind of interference. Radio transmissions from distant stations, perhaps, or acoustic anomalies created by the unique geography of the plateau. But when I cleaned up the audio files and listened more carefully, I realized the whispers weren't random noise. They were conversations, carried on in a language I didn't recognize, speaking with an urgency and intensity that made my skin crawl. The voices seemed to be responding to each other, asking questions and receiving answers, as if an entire community existed somewhere out there in the endless wilderness. I spent my first night at the station downloading and analyzing the audio files. The whispers occurred primarily during the coldest hours, between midnight and dawn, when temperatures dropped below -40. They seemed to originate from different directions, suggesting multiple sources scattered across the plateau. Sometimes the voices were so faint they were barely distinguishable from wind noise. Other times they were clear enough that I could make out individual words, though in no language I'd ever heard. The strangest aspect was how the voices seemed to be aware of the recording equipment. They would grow silent whenever I approached the microphones, resuming only after I'd moved away. Several times, I caught fragments of conversation that included what sounded like my name, spoken with an inflection that suggested they knew I was listening. On my second night, I decided to investigate. I bundled up in my warmest gear and ventured out into the brutal cold, following the bearing where the voices seemed strongest. The plateau stretched endlessly in all directions, a flat expanse of snow and ice broken only by occasional rock outcroppings. The wind was constant, creating a background noise that made it difficult to pinpoint specific sounds. I walked for about a mile, guided by a handheld GPS and the faint glow of the station's lights behind me. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and even through my insulated clothing, I could feel the cold penetrating to my bones. I was about to turn back when I saw them. Scattered across the snow were dozens of small mounds, each about the size of a person. At first, I thought they might be natural formations, wind-carved drifts or exposed rocks. But as I got closer, I could see they were too regular, too purposeful in their arrangement. They formed rough circles and lines, like some kind of pattern or message written in the snow. I approached one of the mounds and brushed away the loose snow on top. What I found underneath made me step back in horror. It was a person, or what remained of one. The body was perfectly preserved by the cold, but it had been there for a very long time. The clothing was old-fashioned, the kind worn by trappers and prospectors from the early 1900s. The face was peaceful, almost serene, but the lips were moving. The corpse was whispering. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. The dead man's lips continued to move, forming words I couldn't understand, but delivering them with the same urgent intensity I'd been hearing through the recording equipment. I looked around at the other mounds with new understanding. They were all graves, and judging by the faint sounds carried on the wind, all of the bodies were still speaking. I ran back to the station, my mind reeling from what I'd discovered. The plateau wasn't just a weather monitoring site. It was a massive graveyard, populated by people who had died in the wilderness over the past century. Trappers, prospectors, hunters, all sorts of people who had gotten caught in storms or lost their way in the endless expanse of the interior. But somehow, the extreme cold and unique atmospheric conditions had preserved not just their bodies, but their voices. Back at the station, I listened to the recordings with new ears. The whispers weren't random conversations. They were the final thoughts and words of people who had died alone in the wilderness, preserved and transmitted across the years by some phenomenon I couldn't begin to understand. They were telling their stories, sharing their last moments, calling out to loved ones who would never hear them. Some spoke of families they'd left behind, others of regrets and missed opportunities. A few described their final days in detail, explaining how they'd gotten lost or injured, how they'd fought against the cold until they couldn't fight anymore. The voices overlapped and intermingled, creating a chorus of the dead that rose and fell with the wind. But the most disturbing realization was that the voices were getting stronger. Each night, the recordings picked up more conversations, more individual speakers. The dead were somehow becoming more active, more aware, and they seemed to know about me. On my third night, I heard my own name spoken clearly through the monitoring equipment. Not whispered or garbled, but pronounced distinctly in a voice I didn't recognize. Then another voice joined in, and another, until a whole chorus of the dead was calling my name, inviting me to join their eternal conversation. I tried to leave the next morning, but the weather had turned. A massive storm system was moving in, bringing blizzard conditions that would make flying impossible for at least a week. I was trapped at the station with the voices of the dead, and they seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. The whispers began to include personal details about my life. Things nobody could know, memories from my childhood, private thoughts I'd never shared with anyone. The dead were somehow reading my mind, absorbing my experiences, and adding them to their collective knowledge. They spoke of my fears and regrets, my hopes and dreams, as if they'd lived them themselves. By the fourth night, I could hear them without the recording equipment. The voices carried on the wind, speaking directly to my ears, no longer requiring electronic amplification to reach me. They told me stories of their own deaths, describing the peace that came with letting go of the struggle, the relief of finally resting in the eternal cold. They began to make sense to me. These weren't malevolent spirits trying to harm me. They were lonely souls who had died alone and forgotten, grateful for any human contact after decades of isolation. They wanted to share their experiences, to pass on their stories, to feel connected to the world of the living once more. On the fifth night, I walked back out to the graveyard. This time, I wasn't afraid. The voices guided me, whispering directions and encouragement as I made my way across the frozen plateau. I found a spot among the arranged mounds and sat down in the snow, feeling the cold seep through my clothing. The conversations grew louder, more distinct. I could make out individual speakers now, Jeremiah, who had died prospecting for gold in 1923. Mary, who had gotten lost while traveling to meet her husband in 1934. Robert, who had crashed his small plane during a blizzard in 1967. They welcomed me into their community, sharing their stories and listening to mine. I'm still at the weather station, though I stopped reporting in days ago. The storm has passed, but I have no desire to leave. The voices have shown me something beautiful, a community of souls who have found peace in death, who continue to exist and communicate long after their bodies have failed. They've invited me to stay, to become part of their eternal conversation. The cold doesn't bother me anymore. My body is shutting down gradually, peacefully, as the temperature takes its toll. But my voice is growing stronger. Soon, I'll join the whispers on the wind, adding my story to the chorus of the dead. The recording equipment will pick up my voice, and someday, another maintenance worker will come to investigate the strange sounds coming from WX-47. If you ever find yourself alone in the Alaskan wilderness, listen carefully to the wind. Sometimes it carries more than just the sound of weather. Sometimes it carries the voices of those who came before, still telling their stories, still calling out across the endless cold. And maybe, if you listen long enough, you'll hear something worth staying for. The conversation never ends here. There's always someone new to talk to, someone new to welcome into our community. The dead are never really gone. We just change the way we speak to the world. Let's move to our final story. My name is Miller, and I discovered that some Alaskan towns don't appear on any map for a very good reason. I work as a traveling equipment technician for telecommunications companies, maintaining cell towers and internet infrastructure across remote areas of Alaska. It's a job that takes me to places most people never see. Tiny settlements, abandoned mining camps, and forgotten outposts scattered throughout the wilderness. I've visited hundreds of these locations over the past 15 years, but I'd never encountered anything like the town of Stillwater. The assignment came through my company's dispatch system on a Tuesday morning. A cell tower in Stillwater had gone offline 3 weeks ago, and local residents were complaining about complete loss of communication services. The work order included GPS coordinates, estimated population of 200 people, and a note that the town was accessible by a logging road about 40 miles north of Anchorage. What struck me as odd was that I'd never heard of Stillwater before, despite working this region for years. I checked multiple maps, road atlases, GPS databases, even old geological surveys, but found no reference to any settlement at those coordinates. When I called the company office to verify the information, they confirmed the work order and insisted that Stillwater was a legitimate community that had been receiving service for decades. I loaded my truck with equipment and supplies for what I expected to be a routine 2-day job. The GPS coordinates led me to a barely visible dirt road that branched off from a major logging route. There were no signs, no indicators that anyone lived down this particular track. But my navigation system insisted I was heading in the right direction. The road wound through dense forest for about an hour, getting narrower and more primitive with each mile. Just when I was beginning to think I'd made a wrong turn, the trees opened up to reveal a valley containing what appeared to be a perfectly normal small town. Stillwater looked like it had been frozen in time around 1950. The buildings were well maintained, but architecturally dated. Wooden houses with large porches, a general store with hand-painted signs, a small church with a white steeple. The streets were clean and tree-lined, and I could see people going about their daily business. It was picturesque in an almost unreal way, like a movie set designed to represent idealized small-town America. I found the cell tower easily enough. a standard telecommunications mast located on a small hill behind the town. The equipment had suffered what appeared to be storm damage, with several components burned out by what looked like a lightning strike. The repairs would be straightforward, but would require me to stay overnight since I'd arrived late in the day. I drove into town looking for lodging and was directed to a small inn run by an elderly woman named Helen. She was friendly, welcoming, though something about her manner seemed slightly off. She spoke in a formal way that felt outdated, using phrases and expressions I hadn't heard in years. When I mentioned that Stillwater wasn't on any of my maps, she laughed and said the town preferred to keep a low profile. The inn was comfortable and clean, decorated with furniture and fixtures that looked authentically vintage. My room had no television or telephone, which Helen explained by saying the town avoided modern distractions. There was no cell service, which wasn't surprising given the damaged tower. But what puzzled me was the complete absence of any electronic devices throughout the building. That evening, I ate dinner at the town's only restaurant, a cozy place that served simple but well-prepared food. The other patrons were pleasant and talkative, asking about my work and expressing gratitude that their communication services would soon be restored. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice subtle inconsistencies in their conversations. Everyone I spoke with seemed to have lived in Stillwater for decades, but none of them could provide specific details about the town's history or how long it had been established. They spoke vaguely about the old days and when we first came here, but their timelines didn't make sense. Some people looked much younger than they claimed to be, while others seemed far older than their stated ages. More disturbing were the references they made to the outside world. They talked about current events and recent news, but their information was consistently wrong, not just outdated, but completely inaccurate. They mentioned political figures who didn't exist, technological developments that hadn't happened, and cultural trends that bore no resemblance to reality. I spent a restless night at the inn, disturbed by strange dreams and a persistent feeling that something was fundamentally wrong about Stillwater. When I woke the next morning, I was eager to complete my repairs and leave as quickly as possible. The work on the cell tower went smoothly, and by mid-afternoon, I had restored full functionality to the communications equipment. But when I tested the system, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The tower was receiving and transmitting signals, but they weren't connecting to any network I recognized. Instead of standard cellular traffic, the system was handling communications that made no sense. Phone calls between numbers that didn't exist, data transfers to servers that weren't in any database, messages that contained fragments of conversations in languages I'd never heard. It was as if the tower was connecting to some parallel version of the telecommunications network, one that existed alongside but separate from the real world. I tried to call my company office to report the anomaly, but my phone showed no signal despite standing directly beneath a fully operational tower. When I attempted to use the town's landline system, I could only reach numbers within Stillwater itself. The outside world had become completely unreachable. That's when I realized the horrible truth about the town. I walked back through the streets, observing details I'd missed before. The newspapers in the general store were dated with current dates, but contained stories about events that had never happened. The photographs on the walls showed the same people I'd met, but they appeared unchanged in pictures supposedly taken decades apart. The residents of Stillwater weren't entirely human. They were some kind of echoes or shadows of people who had once existed, preserved in a pocket of reality that existed parallel to our own world. The town was a trap, a place that captured travelers and gradually transformed them into permanent residents who would never age, never leave, and never truly exist in the real world again. I tried to drive out of town immediately, but every road I took led back to Stillwater's main street. The forest had somehow rearranged itself, creating an endless loop that made escape impossible. The GPS in my truck showed me driving in straight lines for miles, but I always ended up back where I started. As evening approached, the residents began to behave differently. They watched me with knowing smiles, no longer bothering to maintain their friendly facades. Helen at the inn told me my room would be ready for another night, and when I protested that I needed to leave, she simply said that no one ever left Stillwater. I'm writing this account on the third night of my imprisonment, using equipment from my truck while parked at the edge of town. The cell tower is still functioning, still processing its phantom communications, but I can't reach the outside world. My truck's GPS shows my location as a blank space on the map, coordinates that correspond to nothing but empty wilderness. The worst part is that I can feel myself changing. My memories of the real world are becoming hazier, less important. The concerns and responsibilities of my former life seem distant and irrelevant. The residents of Stillwater are beginning to make sense, their timeless existence starting to appeal to me. I understand now why the town doesn't appear on maps. It exists in the spaces between places, in the gaps where reality grows thin. It feeds on travelers who venture too far from marked roads, capturing them and adding them to its collection of eternal residents. If anyone finds this account, stay away from unmarked roads in remote Alaska. Don't trust GPS coordinates that lead to places you can't find on maps. And if you ever come across a town that seems too perfect, too frozen in time, turn around immediately. I can hear Helen calling me for dinner. The other residents are gathering on their porches, waving and smiling, welcoming me home. My truck keys feel heavy in my hands, and I'm beginning to think that maybe staying wouldn't be so bad after all. Tomorrow I might not even remember why I wanted to leave. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey through Alaska's darkest secrets. These stories remind us that the wilderness holds mysteries far beyond our understanding, where the line between reality and nightmare becomes impossibly thin. If you enjoyed these spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe to Silent Fears for more horror stories that will keep you awake at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest explorations into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe and remember, in the vast wilderness of Alaska, you're never truly alone.